Good morning, everyone. So today we're going to talk about behavioral observation and how it allows us to collect data about participants, whether they're human or non-human animals. Behavioral observation is defined as the systematic, objective description of any kind of motor behavior. So this can vary from the simplest of behaviors like eye blinks or finger tapping to more complex social behaviors such as language, communication between organisms, social behavior such as grooming, as you can see here in the images. These behaviors can be categorized based off how long they last. So they're usually divided up into two categories. They are either event behaviors. Event behaviors are discrete, short-lived behaviors. They only last for a fraction of a second or maybe a second. And we normally will just count the frequency of those behaviors. Examples of these would be things like laughter, growling, smiling, or a handshake. Most of these don't last very long typically, and so we can easily count the frequency of them. It would be more difficult if we wanted to try to capture the duration of these behaviors. There are also state behaviors. State behaviors are those that have a reliably measurable duration. My best example of this is going to be, so our rule that we use is that these are behaviors that last for 3 or more seconds. So 1, 2, 3. As long as it lasts that long, we generally can try to measure the duration of it. You can imagine, though, if it's a behavior that changes frequently, it's something that you do and then you stop, and you do it again and you stop, that might not be the best behavior to measure using duration, and you might instead try to count the frequency of it, the number of times it's happening, and that would be an event. Examples of state behaviors are things like talking, cell phone use, how long someone is sitting still, how long students are taking notes, how long someone is holding hands, sitting in close proximity to another animal. So you can see in the picture here of these African vervet monkeys that are grooming one another. This is a mom and her 3 daughters. You may not see the third one, but it's wrapped around the ventrum, the stomach of the mother. And they sit very close to each other and they groom each other. These social or affiliative behaviors help to form bonds in primates. So this is one way in which you can divide up behaviors into events or states. You can also look at how we're going to define behaviors. So this will lead into the description of the assignment you're going to work on today. Operational definitions for behaviors are the precise descriptions of the behaviors that are going to be recorded, and often they include things that we're not going to record, things that we want to leave out. I was talking about the example in class the other day of the face touching study we used to do. In the face touching study, we would count face touching to be finger contact on your face, around your neck, but not in your hair. It wasn't moving your glasses. It could be scratching your eyelid. So some behaviors counted, and some other behaviors that were things that were near your face we wouldn't count. If you have multiple behaviors that you're collecting, that list of behaviors and their operational definitions is called an ethogram. You'll often see ethograms used in animal behavior research as we try to collect lots of behaviors about activity, play behavior, hunger, social behavior, grooming behavior, communication. Sometimes when we would collect data on primates, we would collect up to 36 or even 40 different behaviors at a time that you're looking for. And skilled observers can easily gather all of that information on a limited number of animals. So let's take an example of an operational definition. I'm going to start with my research question, which is, I want to know whether play behavior differs between toddlers and preschool age children. So those are kids who are about 18 months to 3 years of age. Those are toddlers. And preschool age children who are ages 3 to 5. I need to define the variables that I'm going to measure. And that's going to be the types of play the children are showing. And then I have to define what goes into those play behaviors and some examples of those play behaviors and what doesn't count. So let's take a look here. One of the ways, and play behavior in humans is really complicated, and there are a lot of ways we can describe it. Here's a simple ethogram for play behavior in humans. For young kids, I might look at solitary play, parallel play, and then cooperative play. Solitary play is when children are playing alone, and they're at least, let's say, I'm going to use in my definition, 3 feet away from the closest child, okay? You can define whatever is relevant for you. If I were looking at kids in a really enclosed small space, they may not be able to get 3 feet away from each other. So I might need to change my definition based on what's going on in the environment. If I'm looking out at a playground, it may be very easy for kids to get away from each other, and then you can reliably score solitary play. The first kind of social play that develops in kids is parallel play. This is when kids choose to spend time next to each other, but they're not actually working on the same task. They're not working together. So I may have my crayons right here next to my friend, and I'm working on my crayons, and then my friend over there is working on Legos. But we've actually chosen to sit near each other. Parallel play will start to develop at around 18 months of age, but as kids get to about the age of 3, they're starting to move into more advanced kinds of play. Okay, so parallel play is when you're not actually doing the same task, but you are choosing to sit next to each other. Cooperative play is when children are working on a group goal or a group task. So we're playing Red Rover, Red Rover. We're all building something with Legos, so we're all trying to build a house together. Any sort of shared group task. Chutes and ladders would be an example of a game that would be cooperative play, right? So we're all working together towards some goal. But play even gets more complicated than that. So this is just one example of kind of a simple way, but especially if I'm starting to work with kids who are ages 4, 5, 6, 7 or older, then we start to get into more complex kinds of play. So here are some examples of what I might look for. You might see rough-and-tumble-play, which is play fighting, tickling, kids running around and playing superheroes or martial arts. It's usually playful physical contact. You would want to make sure that this doesn't include actual aggression or violence between kids. So and you can tell the point where kids go from you remember when you were a kid, you're playing, and then all of a sudden somebody gets hurt and somebody takes a swing at someone else. So rough and tumble play can very easily become violence, but typically, especially for young kids, most of their time is spent doing that rough and tumble play, and most things do not end up in being aggressive interactions. There's also constructive play, where children are building something. They're manipulating objects to create something new. This could be art projects, Legos, blocks, anything where they're building something, sand play. Formalized play would be games and sports where there's an agreed upon set of rules. Children who are ages 4 through 6 have very set rules, and those rules are not very flexible. You'll see that when children start to get to 6 or 7, the rules they now can agree can be changed. So you'll see in second graders or third graders, now they start to mix up the rules of the games they play to encounter, right? They start to realize, oh, look, we don't have to play it this way every single time. Lastly is dramatic or imaginary play. This is where kids are portraying imaginary roles. So they are playing house, they are playing cats and dogs, they're in a zoo, whatever it might be that they're imagining they're playing with others. So again, there are lots of different ways that you can operationally define play and lots of different play you could look at. So that just gives you one example of a way we might construct an ethogram about play behavior. So the assignment that I have for you today is taking a look at 4 different scenarios where a researcher has a question they want to know. You have to create or generate an independent variable and then generate an operational definition based off of that variable. Then you have to generate a dependent variable and an operational definition of that variable. So I'm going to walk you through one example of this, and then you can email me if you have further questions. So a researcher wants to know if media violence leads to more rough and tumble play. Right? I want to know if kids who are watching or playing lots of violent video games, do they get in more rough and tumble play? And then I might have an extended question about, do they then become more aggressive? Okay. But for this example, we're just going to look at rough and tumble play. So I take a group of kids of similar ages, right? Because I want to make sure they're at a similar developmental point. So let's say I'm going to do 6 and 7-year-olds, so all kids in the same grade. Now, the participants in this example are never a variable, right? Participants don't vary. They're just the subjects or the volunteers that are in your study, okay? My independent variable, as you've probably already guessed, is the media violence, right? Because I want to know if media violence causes a change in their play behavior. So now I need to generate an experiment where I'm going to manipulate how much media violence these kids are exposed to. There are a lot of ways you can do this. My operational definition, the way I'm going to standardize it in my study, is I'm going to have these children come into a research laboratory, or while at school or after school, they're going to come and watch 30 minutes of violent cartoons for half of the kids. The other half that I've selected are going to also watch 30 minutes of cartoons, but these are going to be nonviolent cartoons. They're going to do this every day for a month, okay? During this month, though, I need to measure the behavior of these kids. Now, it is too difficult to measure all the different kinds of play behavior, so I'm specifically narrowing in on only rough and tumble play, and that's going to be my dependent variable, right? Because I believe that media violence causes a change in the dependent variable, which in this case is the rough and tumble play. Again, not all kinds of play behavior because that would be too complicated, so I'm just going to narrow in on rough and tumble play. So my operational definition, how I'm going to measure this play behavior, is I'm just going to look at recess time because that's a time when kids can clearly show rough and tumble play, so it's easy for me to monitor. It's limited. It's only a few minutes a couple times during the day, and I can do that daily during the week while they're at school. So my operational definition is just going to be the duration of rough and tumble play, so how many seconds or how many minutes they're engaged in rough and tumble play during recess. Okay? So that kind of walks you through an example of how I might go from a research question about media violence and rough and tumble play, generating an independent and then a dependent variable and the associated operational definitions. You might also say that my operational definition of rough and tumble play is not going to include violence. So if they actually get in a fight, that doesn't count. It's only the time that they spent actually playing with one another. Okay, so do that for those other 4 examples. Now, let's keep talking about some other things about observation. We always want to be worried about observational bias in the studies that we're doing. Because researchers are easily affected by the behaviors they see around them, observers might be more likely to notice obvious or unusual behaviors. If kids on the playground that you're observing start to get in a fight, your attention is going to be drawn over there. But one of the things that we learned in watching monkey behavior is that in fact subordinate animals, right, the ones who are kind of on the outskirts of the social group, often realize that when fights go on, that a lot of interesting behavior and everyone's attention is drawn that way, which that's the time when those subordinate animals can usually get access to food and other things they wouldn't normally get. So if you actually are only looking at the animals engaged in an aggressive interaction, you're going to miss a lot of other important behaviors. You also, because researchers always have hypotheses that they've generated that they think explain the behaviors they're watching, you might only be recording behaviors that confirm your own hypothesis. So you also want to generate alternative hypotheses and behaviors that might be associated with those alternative hypotheses so that you aren't subject to that, what we call the confirmation bias. Lastly, always realize that your participants are very reactive to being watched. Human adults don't necessarily always notice when they're being observed, but if you were to do an observation of the Child Development Center, the kids in the Child Development Center are really sensitive to when people come in to watch them, and they're social and they're nice, and so they want to come over and hang out with you. So that means they're not going to behave normally if they can see you in the room necessarily. My recommendation if you're going to watch kids is that you shouldn't make eye contact. You should say hi to them if they come up and interact with you, and then you should encourage them to go play and continue doing what they're doing. Similarly with animals, it sometimes can take up to a year to get wild animals used to human observers, and so it takes a lot of time and patience on the part of a researcher to make sure that they're habituating those animals to their presence, and then they can actually record the behavior of those animals. The other things when you're doing an observation that you might record would be things like the time of day, the date itself, the duration of your observation. Now, hopefully, you're observing every individual for the same amount of time. If you observe one group of kids for 10 minutes and another group of kids for an hour, of course, the group that you observe for an hour is likely going to do more behavior. You were watching them for longer. So you want to try to standardize the amount of time you're observing them. In addition, people's behavior and animals' behavior changes across the day. You realize that as it gets close to lunchtime, you start getting fidgety and hungry and start thinking about other things. Or as it gets close to the end of class, you start getting fidgety and thinking about other things. You want to record those things such as the time and the date and things that might be relevant to your observation. Lastly, you want to also include things like weather, noise, other things that might have affected the behavior. When we used to watch monkeys, if a snake or a rat ever walked through a monkey cage, everybody freaks out. So if you see that happen, you want to know that that occurred, because that's going to change their behavior than what they might typically be doing. Not only do monkeys, by the way, not like snakes, they also hate rats. They're just like you and me. There are 3 ways that we can record behavior, and we're going to talk about those because it will probably help you to decide what you're going to do for your final project if you decide to do behavioral observation. So the first one is what's called an ad libitum observation. In an ad libitum observation, you record all the behaviors in field notes or in an audio or video recorder. So you just try to observe everything. You can observe lots of behaviors in very large groups. So this is very common in anthropological, sociological research, and also for researchers doing work in the wild with animals. The problem with this method is that because you're trying to record everything, right, you're just trying to take notes as quick as you can, you might miss some more low-key behaviors, so like facial expressions. Smiles and fear expressions are really easy to miss, so if you're not specifically looking for them, you probably aren't going to notice them, and you're probably going to favor the more obvious kinds of behaviors. Calls, screams, aggressive interactions, that kind of stuff. Also, your ad libitum observation might be really hard to quantify, because you're just going to have a list of notes about what you observed, and then later on you want to try to make numbers out of that. That can be hard to do unless you've set up your observation to do it purposefully ahead of time. So I'm going to take a note of every time I see in a fight, I'm going to make a check mark on my sheet of paper, right? That would be one way that you could try to quantify that. Also, as you might imagine, as you've ever gone back and looked at your notes 3 days after you took them from class, if you wait a long time to transcribe your notes or to listen to your field recorder, it can be hard to remember why you said or wrote the things that you did. So we always encourage researchers who do ad lib or ad libitum observation to transcribe their notes right away so that you can remember why you said or wrote down the things you did. But you might also want to go the other direction. Maybe you don't want to record data from a giant group. You want to focus on just a few individuals. And you want to get a lot of very detailed, very low-key kinds of behaviors like facial expressions. In that case, you might use focal observation. In a focal observation, you observe the behavior of only a few individuals. This allows the observer to record a lot of behaviors and even sequences of behaviors. This animal did this, and this animal responded this way. This first animal then responded a different way. So you can get some really complex and some very low-key kinds of subtle behaviors, such as facial expressions, small calls that animals might make under their breath that you can't hear. In primates, one of the ways that they tell you that they're getting upset or angry when you're too close to them is that they'll wiggle their ears. So that is the very first thing they do that says, I'm uncomfortable, you better back off, right? That's the beginning of a threat. It then goes to a stare, then it goes to an open mouth stare, then it goes to a charge, right, where they kind of move towards you. So the open mouth stare and the charge are probably easy to see, but the ear wiggle you might miss if you're not looking for it, right? So focal observation would allow you to see that. Of course, the problem with focal observation is that it's really easy to get tired. We used to have students come out and do observations in the outdoor field cages in spring of the monkeys, so they would sit for about 20 minutes. I will not tell you how many times I found students falling asleep in the grass watching monkeys, because a lot of the times they're just hanging out. If you've ever been to the Oakland Zoo, the animals are just chill. Like they're just hanging in the field there, and so there's not a lot to see. In addition, because it's really easy to get distracted and it's easy to get bored, you can miss the behaviors of what you're trying to look for, and you can also miss behavior of other participants. If you're only focused on 2 or 3 individuals, you're not going to be able to notice what's going on in the other individuals. And that's okay, because really the goal is in this case to really focus on just a couple of individuals. Our third method of observation combines ad libitum and focal observation. This is called interval observation. In an interval observation, you measure behaviors at regular intervals, so every minute. So it has both traits of focal and ad lib. I can record multiple behaviors, and every minute when my stopwatch goes off, I mark down how many kids are playing, okay? How many kids are engaged in rough-and-tumble-play. So the advantage of that is at the end of a 20-minute interval, right, I've got 20 one-minute marks that I can say, oh, of these 20 intervals that I was looking at, in 5 of them, right, for 5 of the minutes, my children that I was observing were engaged in rough-and-tumble-play. All right, so it allows you to observe a larger group of individuals. You can focus on a couple of behaviors. So the method that I just described is where you record behaviors at the beginning of an interval. So when the stopwatch goes off, you look around, you see what everyone is doing, and you put check marks to say, yes, they're doing this, or no, they're not. An alternative is you could mark it anytime during the interval. So if anytime during this 1 minute block somebody gets in a fight, that person gets a check mark. Okay, and so you can see the number of fights that are happening. One of the problems with interval observation is that because if you're only marking at the beginning of an interval, you might miss some rare behaviors such as fights, such as threats. So that's why if you're looking for rare behaviors like aggression or play behavior in a group of animals that isn't showing a lot of play behavior, I might encourage you to do method number 2, which is to record behaviors that happen anytime during the interval rather than just at the beginning of the interval. Okay, I'm going to stop right there. Please email me with any questions about the assignment or observation itself.